Hey, folks. So today's lecture is going to focus on three authors whose work on economic inequality really gives us a broad kind of historical and theoretical perspective on the topic. The first is Thomas Piketty, who is a French economist. He wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century that became a bestseller a few years ago. Um, not easy for an economist to write a bestseller, but I think the timing was perfect in terms of fitting with people's evolving concerns about inequality. Manker Olson is or was an economist who um, wrote some of the seminal work on public goods theory, and then Walter Scheidel is a economic historian um, who's written one of the big books on the history of inequality. So, um, so let's jump right into. We're going to talk about each in turn. We'll begin with Thomas Piketty, um, and Piketty basically says he's looking at the division of national income between capital, those who own the means of production, those who own assets, stocks, bonds, uh, physical assets like factories, um, who own property, land, even things like art, jewelry, who own assets that themselves produce income in the form of dividends or interest and that sort of thing. So the how much of the national income goes to the owners of capital after taxes, and how much goes to those who work for a living, whose income comes in the form of compensation for their labor. And he says there are two major factors that determine the relative distribution of income between capital and labor. One is the wealth to income ratio. So you take the total value of all the wealth in a country. Again, these are assets such as those I mentioned before. He also uses the term interchangeably capital, wealth, as meaning the same thing basically. So you take all of the value of all of the wealth in a society, and you compare it with the annual income. Income is a flow of of money or value in a given period of time. So you look and see how does how many more times of annual income does wealth make up. So it's a ratio of wealth to income. The second factor is what he calls the pure return on capital. He just means that you subtract, you focus on capital after taxes, and then you subtract, any losses. Some businesses lose money instead of make money, and you come up with the pure return on capital. What percentage of capital invested is comes back in the form of basically profit. He says if we know those two things, then we can figure out capital's share of overall income relative to labor. Now, um, when both of these are rising, when the ratio of wealth to income is growing, when the pure rate of return on capital is growing, then it's necessarily labor's share of income is going down, capital's share is going up. And then therefore inequality tends to it will increase by definition. When both are falling, when the wealth income ratio is declining, when the pure return on capital falls, then the opposite happens. Labor's share of income rises and capital's share falls. Now, Piketty argues that there's a tendency for the wealth income ratio and the pure return on capital to stabilize at high levels during times of peace and stability. And he says that at the same time, he says that economic growth is comes from a combination of population increase because the more labor there is in an economy, the more that gets produced, and then productivity growth, which is the amount of goods and services that are produced for a given quantity of labor. So, the amount produced per worker per hour, for instance. So if the amount of labor is rising and the productivity of labor is going up, then you get economic growth. And economic growth means that the pie is increasing in size, therefore labor and capital could potentially both end up better off in absolute terms because of economic growth, even if the gains are not distributed equally between the two. One of the reasons that Piketty is pretty pessimistic about the future of inequality is that he argues that population is actually in most advanced countries is either stable or falling. In the United States, it's likely to continue to increase very, very slowly, and that's only because of immigration. If we continue to pursue harsher immigration policies, then population growth, even in the U.S., will probably stall. But in most of Europe, it's actually declining. Japan, it's declining very rapidly. In China, it's also begun to decline. So in many places in the world, population growth is nil or actually negative. And on the other hand, productivity growth, for various reasons that he discusses, Piketty believes that productivity growth will also begin to slow. That we've kind of in the industrial age, we've kind of picked the low-hanging fruit in terms of how to get more out of a given amount of labor, and from here on out, it's going to be more difficult to squeeze out additional increments of productivity. Whether that's true or not, we'll have to see. But if he's right about both those things, then economic growth will tend to decline. And he argues that, in fact, inequality tends to increase. The capital share of income tends to grow during times of slow or negative economic growth. So if you have a high or rising wealth to income ratio, if the return on capital is high and if economic growth is low, then you tend to get a rapid increase in inequality. What would it take for economic inequality to decline? Besides policy changes, which could include taxation, for instance, but you would basically need the return on capital will have to fall faster than economic growth. So if the return on capital is 6% a year and economic growth is only 2% a year, then you're going to get rapid growth in inequality. If the profit rate is only return on capital is only 1% and the economy is growing 2%, then you'll get less inequality. But that's not typical. All right, so let's look at some of these variables, and we'll begin with the capital income ratio. Remember that the higher the ratio of capital to national income, the more unequal the society is. And so you can see here that this chart shows that in the early 20th century, there was a very high ratio of capital income. The value of capital exceeded the value of national income by about 5 to 1 in 1910. But notice that it fell, starting with the World War I, on through about 1950, Well, what happened during that period? We had two world wars and the Great Depression, as well as major policy shifts such as the New Deal and the development of social welfare programs. So, you know, in that fairly short period of time, we saw the ratio of capital income fall from 5 to 1 to looks like about 2.5 to 1. So it fell in half. Part of this was um, capital destroyed during the two world wars, but a lot of it as well was falling stock prices and bond prices during the Great Depression. Uh, but a major piece of it was, in fact, very high tax rates. Tax levels rose during the Great Depression and especially during World War II. So a lot of capital was taxed away to pay for programs that channeled money into the beginnings of the middle class. Now you see what happens after 1950. That ratio begins to rise again around 2020, where we're at now. It's now about 4.5 times um, income, capital, 4.5 times income. And by the end of the 21st century, it'll be closing in on 7 to 1 if there are no major changes in policy or other kind of disruptions. So so that's capital to income ratio. What about the rate of return on capital, which is the other major factor we have to look at to determine inequality? And this is a chart that you'll notice that it's not to scale, meaning that the distances between the vertical lines that are jutting upward from the bottom axis. Initially, they're 1,000 years, 500 years, 200 years, 120 years. So they keep covering smaller amounts of time, even though the distances, look the same. So be aware of that. The kind of first half of the chart is covering a period of almost 2 millennia, whereas the second half of the chart is covering just a couple hundred years. But what does it show on the left-hand side? The annual rate of return on capital, or the growth in capital. So you can see that for the period from 0 years all the way up to about 1820, up to about 1913, there was a pretty fairly consistent rate of return on capital. It was about 4.5–5% return on capital, and then you can see on the lower lower line with the clear squares. Well, that shows the economic growth rate, and you can see that the first 1,500 years of this of the 2 millennium ago, the economic growth rate was just a fraction of 1%, very, very low. It didn't really begin to exceed 1% per year until the 19th century. That's pretty stunning. So basically, there was almost no economic growth, but the owners of capital enjoyed a return of 4.5 to 5% a year. So obviously, that sustained a very high and growing level of radical inequality. Starting around World War II, though, look what happens. World War I, just after that, starting in 1914, look at the return on capital. It drops radically down to just 1% for the 1913 to 1950 period, that two world wars and Great Depression. Capital just made average income of 1%. On the other hand, the average growth rate grew to almost 2%. So that growth almost, it wasn't quite twice as large as the return on capital, but you'll see that the economic growth continued to rise, and even though the return on capital also rose, they rose in tandem, so that economic growth continued to outpace return on capital all the way through, um, about 20, well, really the last couple decades. And then look what happens. Starting a couple decades ago, we get reversal, and the economic growth rate starts to go down while the return on capital continues to increase. And he projects out to the end of the century. Again, that's speculative. But basically, what he's trying to say here is that for most of recorded history, economic inequality has been partly a product of a high rate of return on capital combined with a very low economic growth rate. But we had a kind of golden age, starting with World War I up through the end of the century, where, in fact, on a global basis, economic growth exceeded the rate of capital returns, and that allowed for growing equality. Now, the other factor to look at is population growth rates. That is a factor when it comes to predicting economic growth. And you can see that economic growth coincided with a period of rapid population growth during this last century, but that population growth has declined in recent decades and will continue to decline even more radically throughout this century, so that that will slow down the rate of economic growth. And if the rate of return on capital rises back up to its 4.5–5% average, while economic growth settles into 1 or 2%, then we're going to see, even from where we're at now, we're going to see some major increases in inequality. All right, that's Piketty. Let's talk about Manker-Olson. So Manker-Olson basically looks at the impact of organized interests on society. And he argues basically that organized interests, with the exception we'll talk about in a bit, tend to slow down economic growth because they tend to, organized interests tend to use their organizational power to increase their share of the pie at the expense of unorganized interests. So those people who aren't part of business associations or unions or other kinds of groups that accumulate the power to attract resources. So basically says there are two kinds of economic associations. One are groups that advocate for pro-growth policies that produce benefits spread relatively equally across society. That's the rare kinds of groups that I mentioned. And then there are groups that advocate for policies that redistribute existing resources from others, unorganized interests, to its own members. And so the question then is, which of these two groups, the good organized interests or the bad organized interests, are easier to organize and sustain? And Olson argues that narrow associations are bad and encompassing associations are good. Narrow associations, they gain by pushing the costs onto non-members, by seeking a bigger slice of the pie. Consider that you have a factory where, let's say, 40% of the workers are part of a union, and the other 60% are not. And the union just bargains for wage increases for its own members, and the others have to, accept whatever offer is made by management. Well, in that case, the narrow association, the that represents a minority of the overall working pool will tend to advocate for wages that exceed the productivity growth of workers as a whole in that company. So generally, you would say that wages fairly would be increases would be fair if they match the growth in productivity, right? Well, if you're a union and you control 40% of the members, you're not going to want to settle just for a wage increase that reflects productivity growth. You're going to want to get a bigger increase by taking some money, resources away from the unorganized workers and distribute them to the organized workers. So you're going to pressure the company to basically offer the union workers a better deal than they offer the unorganized workers. So that's a narrow association taking advantage of their strength vis-a-vis unorganized groups. But what if all of the workers in the company belong to the union? Well, there's no partial or narrow association to basically take resources away from unorganized workers. Instead, all the workers are members of the union. So the union is going to advocate for everyone's behalf. And what would meet the best interests of everyone is to limit their wage demands to productivity growth. Because if they certainly don't want to settle for anything less than the growth of productivity, but if they ask for too much beyond productivity growth, then they begin to weaken the competitiveness of the firm and make it more likely the firm will go out of business or have to cut back on their workforce. So this is a way of showing that actually broad-based unions, as an example, but this works also with business associations or other kind of economic actors, but broad-based unions, such as in Germany, where you have unions that represent all the workers in the auto industry or all the workers in the steel industry, as opposed to unions in the United States where you may get, we have craft unions, so all the plumbers, all the electricians, all of the pipe fitters each have their own union. Well, in the same factory, you may have 6 or 8 different unions, right? That's a kind of fragmented union structure, a bunch of narrowly defined unions as opposed to one big encompassing union. Well, Olson argues that a fragmented structure is of narrow associations is one that will tend to slow down economic growth because each of the associations are going to try to organize to take resources from one another or from unorganized groups instead of looking out for the interests of everybody. This is related to the public goods problem, which you've no doubt run across in other classes, where a public good is one that everybody benefits from, and which is not diminished by consumption. So, a street lamp is the best example because everybody who walks down the street at night benefits from the street lamp. You can't exclude people. It doesn't turn off for some people and on for others. At the same time, it doesn't matter how many people walk past. It doesn't use up the street lamp, the light, in the way that if I eat a hamburger, I'm using that up and it's not available for anybody else. So basically, a public good is one that benefits a lot of people, and once it's produced, it's there for good. But the problem is, how do you get people to actually contribute their fair share to producing public goods? Well, one way you can do that is taxation, but if government's not there to tax, then how does it happen? Well, again, going back to union, the problem is what we call free riders, where the union, in order to be effective, needs to have as many of the workers in a company as possible, and it needs to make sure everybody pays their union dues. Well, if you have an open shop, basically where people, it's voluntary to join the union as opposed to a closed shop where it's required, then contrary to the example I just gave, let's assume that the company is going to give the same wages to all the workers whether they're in the union or not. Then a union that is bargaining for workers' wages is bargaining not only on behalf of members but on behalf of those who are not in the union as well. So the most advantageous position is to benefit from the union bargains that it is able to, the benefits it's able to get from the employer, but not pay the union dues or show up for meetings or go out on strikes and things like that. So that's a free rider. And of course, if there's no compulsion to join the union, then everyone's going to want a free ride, and the union will be, either non-existent or be very weak. So, again, he assumes that public goods that benefit everybody, the kind of goods that encompassing associations provide, those are difficult to organize because of the free rider problem. The other reason why encompassing associations, which again are the good kind of organizing, why they are difficult to organize is because they require large numbers. Right? You have to get all the members of the factory to join the union. And narrow associations require smaller numbers. So basically, narrow associations, which he at some point begins calling distributive coalitions that try to redistribute resources from others to their own members, that they're smaller and thus easier to organize. There are some other reasons why he says narrow associations are easier to organize than encompassing associations. But notice that this produces an asymmetry. The bad kinds of associations, which are small, they're smaller and easier to organize, are going to be more common and more proliferate in greater numbers than encompassing associations, which are bigger and do good things, but are very difficult to organize or to sustain. So he argues that when there are long periods of peace and stability, where there's no political disruption, then these narrow associations tend to proliferate, whereas the encompassing associations either never get off the ground or tend to shrivel over time. And when the society has a large number of narrow associations or distributive coalitions, it leads to growing inequality because those who are part of these, let's say, business associations are able to lobby Congress for tax breaks, or big unions, or professional associations like dentists or lawyers that are able to get the state to require licensing so that they can keep out new members unless they go through a very difficult, process to get licensed. And that, of course, restricts the numbers of doctors or lawyers and then pushes up their wages. So if you have a lot of these distributive coalitions, it produces growing inequality as organized interests take resources from unorganized interests. It also tends to slow down innovation and slow down growth, which is another source of inequality, slow growth. So several implications. One is stable societies with unchanged boundaries tend to accumulate more collusive organizations over time. Second, special interest organizations reduce efficiency and aggregate income, and they also make political life more divisive. And these have different numbers because he has a bunch of other implications. I'm just picking out a few. That distributive coalitions slow down society's capacity to adopt new technologies, and reallocate resources in response to changing conditions. So here we have Olson arguing that the longer a society avoids disruption, the more of these bad associations it accumulates, and the more inequality and the slower growth over time. Now, the third author we're looking at today is Walter Scheidel, and I'll very brief discussion about Scheidel's work. He basically says there are four factors that have historically been responsible for major episodes of leveling. Leveling meaning a reduction in the gap between rich and poor. There are four major factors that have accounted for the episodes of leveling of inequalities in history. The first are plagues, epidemics, famines, and natural disasters. So what happens is that as you have large populations tend to mean that labor is relatively abundant. When labor is abundant, it's then those who need labor, like feudal landlords, can pay less for it because there's a lot of competition for jobs and for income-producing activities. So capital pays less for labor because labor is relatively abundant and easy to find and attract. That means big inequalities. But if you have plagues, epidemics, famines, natural disasters that kill lots of people, then what happens is that all of a sudden, because the population declines so much, labor becomes scarce. And when labor is scarce, those who have survived the plagues can demand higher compensation from capital because there's less competition among workers for those positions. So it's kind of odd, but these terrible disasters in their wake, we've actually seen reduced inequality rather than increased inequality. Now, does that apply to the great pandemic? It's very, very unlikely that the numbers of people who will die from the coronavirus, thank God, will come anywhere close to being enough to reduce the quantity of labor available to capital. And in fact, many of the deaths will be have been among older people who are already out of the workforce. So there's no silver lining on that account from this current disaster that we're living through. Large-scale wars. Again, large-scale wars not only reduce the labor and this allow those who survive to demand higher wages afterwards, but also they tend to destroy factories, they destroy land, they disenfranchise capital, and they also cause states to raise taxes on capital in order to fund wars. Major revolutions, especially revolutions that are built around a leveling ideology, like the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. In those cases, you have capital is dispossessed by the revolutionary state, which takes over all property and distributes it, or at least the earnings from that property, much more equally. So revolution is an equalizer. And then finally, the collapse of state institutions, because capital depends upon the state to protect property rights. And in the absence of a state to protect those rights, then capital either flees or it gets its property gets taken by militias and criminal gangs and marauders, and that has an equalizing effect. So these are not things that one welcomes, of course. One doesn't look forward to plagues or wars or revolutions or collapse. But these are the factors that have kind of, after inequality grows too great, there have been times in history when these what he called four horses of the apocalypse have kind of reset the game by destroying enough capital or empowering workers enough to reduce inequality. What he's found is that incremental reform, just you know, strengthening labor unions or doing some, increasing taxes a bit, or instituting some welfare state reforms, that those are tinkering around the edges, that they can make marginal difference, but they don't, they're not sufficient to carry out a fundamental reset, and they aren't sufficient to stop long-term trends that are favoring capital. So Piketty, Olson, and Scheidel agree that major disruption is required for significant leveling to occur. That doesn't mean that you can't slow the concentration of wealth or even curb it at the margins. But it does mean that it's very difficult to do, and it's not a very common occurrence. So that the period that we lived through from really roughly 1914 to about 1980 was a period of growing equality, the growth of a middle class. That was a very exceptional period in world history. And it was built around the disruptions of two world wars and the Great Depression, as well as the creation of modern democratic social welfare states. So today, as we think about fighting inequality, this reminds us that inequality, really serious efforts to reduce inequality require major disruption. You just can't really get around that. All right, well, that's it for today. Take care.